gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Divinity School tonight on behalf of Positive Investment Cambridge for George's talk on responsible finance. Should the fire alarm sound, you can see the X over there, but there's also one cunningly concealed in this corner here, which you may not see in the paneling. This talk has been organised by Positive Investment Cambridge, and we're a coalition of students, staff and academics campaigning to encourage the university and its colleges to engage in socially and environmentally responsible investment practices. We believe that with money comes power. Investments predict the future, but they also shape the future. And we believe that financial returns, environmental returns and social returns are in no way separable. It's an illusion of a short-termist financial system that one can create wealth by degrading the environment, for instance. We believe that positive investment practices are not more commonplace, not due to a value mismatch in between making money and doing good, but due to certain barriers, communication barriers, information barriers, and education barriers. So we seek to understand the systems that are preventing change, and we seek to exploit those systems to our own advantage. We're not loud, we're not showy, we're not glamorous, but we are highly effective, and we engage directly with those who hold the purse strings, the university administration, the pension funds, the college bursars, in a constructive and a pragmatic fashion. We're working to educate ourselves and others about positive investment strategies. This strategy has proved highly effective. Our open letter to the university, which was signed by hundreds of academics, was widely reported in the national press and was front page news in The Independent. We've recently launched an international campaign to spearhead a large group of institutional investors to do forceful stewardship at the Exxon and the Chevron AGMs later this year. We've also succeeded in getting the university to set up a working group to investigate ethical investment practices, a group on which two of our members, Ellen and Farhan, sit. This is a really important term for Positive Investment Cambridge because the working group's report is going to be released on the 23rd of June. And the contents of the report are extremely significant because of Cambridge's position and its prestige. A bold statement on positive investment practices by Cambridge will doubtless cause many other institutional investors to follow suit. If you're interested in getting involved with this fantastic organisation, come and find any one of us at the end of the talk. We're really delighted to welcome George here this evening to talk about how responsible finance can change the world. He's the founder and former executive director of the UN Global Compact, which is the world's largest voluntary corporate sustainability initiative, with over 8,000 corporate participants in more than 160 countries. He also oversaw the conception and launch of a sister initiative, the UN Principles of Responsible Investment. He currently serves as Vice Chairman of Arabesque Asset Management. And I thought that to begin the meeting, I might read you one of my favourite poems, which is Mushrooms by Sylvia Plath, which has traditionally been interpreted in a feminist light, but I think is appropriate for any silent revolution. Overnight, very whitely, discreetly, very quietly, our toes, our noses take hold on the loam, acquire the air. Nobody sees us, stops us, betrays us. The small grains make room. Soft fists insist on heaving the needles, the leafy bedding, even the paving. Our hammers, our rams, earless and eyeless, perfectly voiceless, widen the crannies, shoulder through holes. We diet on water, on crumbs of shadow, bland-mannered, asking little or nothing. So many of us, so many of us. We are shelves, we are tables, we are meek, we are edible. Nudgers and shovers in spite of ourselves, our kind multiplies. We shall by morning inherit the earth, our foot's in the door. Please join me in welcoming George.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, the student group, the great work you're doing here. It's really, really an honor, a pleasure, a privilege for me to speak to you this evening. I want to share with you the lessons I've learned, the way I see the world, and hopefully I can inspire you in your important and great work and encourage you to be ambitious and to carry your work forward. And I want to do so in probably 5 or 6 different headlines to come up with a bigger narrative that starts, first of all, with how the corporate world has started a journey which is called sustainability, responsibility, where we stand, then looks at the world from what keeps this movement growing, pushing it forward, what are the drivers, are these drivers here to stay, or is this just a fad? a moment in history. And then thirdly, I want to look into the possible pathways for the future. How can we accelerate? How can we move faster? How can we leap into the future? And then I want to change into the topic of finance, where it stands today, what are the current developments, what is the pathway for the future in the world of finance. And you see already, I come from the corporate background more than from the world of finance, but more recently I have switched to the world of finance because I do believe that where we stand today, it is finance that will decide the future of sustainability and responsibility. And this will be my last reflection at the conclusion of my talk. So let me start with a brief review and a step back on the corporate world, the real economy. How serious is business integrating environmental, social and governance issues? Where does it stand today? How far have we come? How far have we yet to go? Well, if we just look back 20 years, none of these issues were on the agenda of the corporate community. Human rights, supply chain issues, environmental pollution, gender issues, corruption in many countries was still tax deductible. In other words, 20 years ago, this movement didn't really exist yet. Yes, there were ethical movements here and there, they were highly localized, they were often faith-based, motivated, but by and large, on the global scale, sustainability and responsibility was not an issue. In the late 90s, as business went global, while governments remained local, many corporations had to learn, some of them the hard way, that some of these external issues actually matter. Campaigns were launched by universities and colleges against sweatshops. Disasters on the environmental side caused an uproar in civil society and spread to many other fields. All of a sudden, some corporations had to learn the hard way that indeed some of these environmental, social issues actually matter. Many corporations had to pay a steep price. Some of them started gradually moving into a different pathway where external issues became part of strategic considerations. But the beginning of this journey was a very slow one, and it was largely motivated by accidents and by campaigns, consumer campaigns, boycotts, and the likes. Then came the moral cause for doing the right thing, and some CEOs who were heading large organizations realized that there's an ethical issue involved between right and wrong, and going global does not just mean looking for the most cost-efficient, low-cost approach to production. It means actually having a longer footprint where you operate. The moral imperative was built up around 2000, 2002, and it gained some momentum. But then over time, something different happened. All of a sudden, the moral imperative was complemented by a material argument. Three big trends played out at the same time. One was transparency, disclosure, making enormous progress in many fields, shining a light on performances even deep down in the supply chain, and making it almost impossible to hide bad performance anymore. And this transparency notion has kept on evolving in important ways. And it made it ever more an unviable strategy to hide the dark side, even deep down in the supply chain. Secondly, another trend kicked in as business became more powerful, and in many countries, the public sector did not keep pace with the growth of the private sector. There was a blurring of the line between what is public and what is private. All of a sudden, business was expected to actually be part of the solution on big societal issues, be it poverty, exclusion, health, education. So companies were expected to increasingly take on greater responsibility. And the moral argument behind it remained very strong. Power and responsibility ultimately cannot be separated. As corporations became more powerful, so stakeholders increasingly projected greater levels of responsibility on the corporate world. This trend continues as of today, And it manifests itself in many important ways. First, on pricing the air, which is no longer just a public good, but also a private good. Water, the ultimate public good, where access to water is a human right on the one hand, but in reality often constrained because of scarcity. So water takes on a public and a private identity. And this trend of the intermingling between the definition of what is a public good and what is a private good continues as of this day. And thirdly, technology itself kept on propelling the agenda forward, making it ever easier to communicate, to disclose. So this confluence of these three trends kept on driving the agenda forward. And today I can say that the corporate sustainability movement is here to stay. It is irreversible. Up to 10,000 corporates worldwide have started the journey, and there are different stages of where they are in implementing external issues in the strategy and operations. But clearly, the journey is here to stay, and it is truly a global movement now. It is no longer a small movement supported by pressure groups in one country or another country. You find this movement in Latin America, in Asia, in South Asia, of course in Europe, in North America. It is a global movement. And slowly a new narrative has emerged on what does it mean to be long-term successful on the corporate side. Slowly a narrative has emerged which basically says that if you want to be successful over time, financially, you also have to be good on environmental, social, and governance issues. In other words, failing on any of these three pillars will make it impossible to be successful over time. You either will hit the roadblock, disaster will happen in one way or the other, or, as a study by Goldman Sachs already 10 years ago showed, that if you want to be a leader, you have to be also leading in these non-financial issues. And that evolution of the narrative behind successful corporate responsibility is still evolving. The evidence that it holds true is getting ever stronger, but it is still a fairly young movement, maybe 15, 20 years old. It still has not yet reached a tipping point where indeed the journey almost has just begun. Because if you consider 10,000 corporates in the world on this track, there are at least 100,000 more that have not yet started the journey. There are so many corporates still out there sitting on a fence, pretending that public priorities are not our concern. All that matters is returns, profits, short-term returns. So the fence sitters still are in a great majority, and those who have started the sustainability movement also vary greatly in the level of integration and performance. According to Global Compact annual impact assessment studies, only 10% of those nearly 10,000 companies you could qualify as being on the leading edge. The other 90% are at different stages of catching up. But clearly the direction is there. They all move in one way. The sustainability imperative is becoming a new business model worldwide. And it's being copied and by small companies in all jurisdictions of the world. So this is the history of the corporate sustainability movement. It is still unfinished. The bottom line really is public and private priorities increasingly overlap. Smart corporate strategies means recognizing and defining what the overlap is, reshaping purpose, strategies and operations to meet both profit motives and criteria, be successful financially, but at the same time also minimize your negative footprint and where possible contribute positively to public priorities. This new paradigm plays out in full swing and keeps on moving. Now, for business, the implications are quite clear. The integration of externalities is becoming a necessary precondition for long-term financial success. Deeper ESG integration is now an issue of board discussion. It has moved upwards. Measurement benchmarks are improving, but it's still a very imperfect world where you can argue a small front end is spearheading a movement, many more are following, but the great majority is still in a waiting position and not yet convinced that this is the way to go. That's in a nutshell where we stand on the corporate side as of today. Now, if you were to analyze what keeps these issues pulling forward, and is this movement likely to achieve a tipping point ever? Is there a chance for corporate responsibility to lead to a renewal of the market system from within? 3 drivers can be identified. One I mentioned already, it is technology and transparency. It is arguably irreversible, it's here to stay. The speed at which information can be exchanged, the ease at which performance can increasingly be measured is improving dramatically every year, every month, every week. This driver is here to stay. Technological change is irreversible, so transparency will continue to shine a light on the dark sides. It will continue to be an incentive for performance improvement on human rights, on workplace conditions, on environmental performance, and on governance issues, including corruption issues. The second driver is the public-private interface. And here, as we are reaching the boundaries of our planet, clearly the drivers increasingly become massive the way they motivate transformation and change in the corporate level. The air is being priced now. Carbon is the currency of the future. Water scarcity already is a reality in many parts of the world. And the most essential fundamental of life is being under threat. Externalities matter ever more. Natural assets, by and large, will appreciate in value. This trend is irreversible. Demographics supported, consumption patterns support that trend. It is here to stay. So clearly, also the second driver is here to stay. It is not a fad. It is not a trend. If anything, it will reinforce in a much more fundamental way the transformation process. The third trend is a more complicated one, and this is where dark clouds can appear any time, and that is governance, how markets are governed. It is still political power and regimes that shape markets, entrepreneurship, and their ability to evolve in one way or the other. It is public sector incentive structures that define on what is profitable and what is not profitable. And it is, of course, the complex interplay of what citizens want and demand and how incentive structures shape corporate performance. But on the governance side, we can see 2 big trends playing out currently. One is we are moving into a new world where the post-World War II era has come to an end already in many parts of the world. Multilateralism, as designed after World War II, is being hollowed out, almost fading away. Multilateral trading systems are giving way to bilateral and regional trading blocs. We can see a fragmentation of the power structure at the global level, which by implication will make it more possible for collective, multilateral, top-down approaches to be implemented effectively. Only 10 years ago, it was easy for a few powerful countries to sit in the blue room of the WTO and to shape the next trade deal. The rest of the world had to buy into it. This is no longer possible. We live in a fragmented power world where many centers have an influence on the same, and where it is increasingly difficult to forge one alliance top-down. Power fragmentation induced by technology also plays out within countries in a very important way. The Edelman Trust Barometer, you may have heard about it, analyzes every year the trend in influence and authority. In the most recent years, we have seen a fundamental shift how authority and influence has flipped. Not too long ago, there were credible institutional players at the country level who could influence public opinion. Some television stations, some credible newspapers who had the power of shaping public opinion by and large. And it was fairly easy for national consensus building. No longer. In a world of digital empowerment, where individuals can self-select to whom they want to listen and which news they want to follow, we see a fragmentation also within every national system. That means it's increasingly difficult, also within a national context, to form a collective opinion top-down. Increasingly, we live in a bottom-up world. In a bottom-up world where individual citizens, individual people have it increasingly in their hands, virtually, to shape the future. And where the top-down influence is no longer the way rules are made, the way behavior is changed. We live in a bottom-up world. It means for the movement, the sustainability movement, there's a whole new emphasis on the next generation, a whole new emphasis on individual people and their behavior, because they have ever more possibilities of shaping and influencing. And this governance trend plays, of course, out across the world in different shapes and forms. In some countries, those in power try to control ever more to avoid that trend to happen. And that happens, unfortunately, on a quite large scale these days in many regions of the world. But by and large, as technological change is irreversible, so is the empowerment of people irreversible as well. In our own analysis within the UN and elsewhere with Arabesque, we coined the term Generation S, Generation Sustainability. Power with the people, with individuals to shape increasingly. And as of today, we can argue there are tens of thousands of individuals working within companies, within the investor community, with consumer movements, who understand there's a link between personal preferences, making choices, and shaping behavior of large organizations through your own example and through your own influence. Generation S is here to grow. Generation S is global in reach. Generation S has many issues, hands-on the sustainability side, on the human rights side, on the environmental side, on the governance side, but clearly there's an awakening and an empowerment process going on that brings with it the possibility of a renewed bottom-up redefinition of what matters and what does not matter, which we have never seen in history before. So this third trend in governance is a complicated one because it has a political dimension which shapes the market constellations overall, and it has a people dimension which shapes national markets from within. Now, if we take it as a given that yes, corporate sustainability is on the move, people empowerment through technology is ever more true, then the question arises, which pathway for the future is the most promising one to accelerate change, to tackle some of the biggest problems we are facing? Inequality, climate change, natural resource boundaries. What is the most promising approach? And in principle, there are four pathways at our disposal. One is to push the corporate sustainability movement much faster to reach tipping point, because 10,000 companies are not yet enough to reshape markets. The other 90,000 must be won over. One does not need to have a majority, but one needs a critical mass, a tipping point. It will take time to grow this movement from 10,000 to say 20,000, but it's clearly a pathway one should continue to pursue. But given how many CEOs still are wedded to the short-termism, it will arguably take time before we reach that tipping point, before markets from within will change behavior in such a way that sustainable practices become the new norm, the new standard. But we should pursue that pathway. The second one is through consumers and people. Cynics may argue that so far, consumer movements haven't really changed markets yet. But again, when you step back, you see important changes happening in food, in health issues, in transportation, and in many other areas. The next generation demands healthier lifestyle, demands more functionality, demands much more practical and easier way. And ideas of ownership are giving way to a new sense of functionality. At the same time, we need to be aware that at least 2 more billion people will join the market within the next 20 years, and these 2 billion people are very hungry for the very basics that we take for granted. As of today, 1 billion people lack access to clean water, they lack access to electricity, they lack access to basic health services. So we have to anticipate that on this globe, which will expand to over 9 billion people by 2050, we have billions of new consumers hitting the market with clear expectations to meet basic needs first. We should continue working on the consumer side, on the citizenship side, and I personally believe we need a revolution there. We need a personal emancipation that redefines consumption, that redefines what we value and what we do and how we do what we do. We should ultimately all have our personal carbon tracker with us, and we should all have with us the ability to measure our impact in social and environmental terms. This is ultimately a responsibility where we come back to the individual level. And supporting initiatives that work towards these ends are arguably one of the big hopes we have for the future. But given the demographic realities of the world today, we have to also realize that it will be a long way to get there. And we have a long outreach to do to win over the majority of people worldwide. The third pathway is governments. We cannot afford to give up on governments. They still have the power of security, they still govern and they set the framework. And the Paris Accord gave new hope. The new climate regime is indeed quite remarkable, because for the first time in modern history, all governments have agreed that climate change is a real issue that has to be tackled. All governments in principle have agreed about the importance of changing something so that we can keep global warming within 2 degrees Celsius. We cannot give up on governments. We have to push on that front. And last week's historic signing ceremony at the UN, where 175 governments signed on to the Paris Agreement, is a major step in that direction. It keeps momentum, it keeps the momentum going. The key challenge, of course, as always, with wonderful frameworks, is implementation, and that job that has just started. On that score, I will come back just in a moment on the climate agenda, but clearly we cannot afford to give up on governments. We have to work on them to do away with perverse subsidies that reward dirty consumption, and to switch towards a new era where clean and responsible is the new currency. And there's much to be done, because the world is very, very imperfect. Just a reality check, 70 countries around the world suffer from systemic corruption. Systemic meaning it's next to impossible to come up with a clear performance-related criteria that drives good, responsible behavior, because the basic government framework is dysfunctional. 1.5 billion people live under fear, meaning governments fail utterly in even providing the most important public service of all, security. So there's a long way to go, and there are tensions, there's conflict. Governments historically have not been enlightened together, and one could easily give up on them. But the argument clearly is they have leverage, they have power, they matter. Any inducement we can do to improve the policy framework to reward sustainable performance is key for the future. And here comes the fourth pathway, and that is finance. Cynics among you may argue that it's an illusion to make finance a force for good, to shift finance so it rewards good performance, and it accelerates the shift towards greater responsibility. Cynics and others will tell us that only recently one of the biggest debt transfers ever has happened. As a result of speculation, ordinary citizens had to bail out. Cynics will also remind us of the many scandals that have come with the financial industry, and the fact that sometime in the 70s or 80s, the world of finance de-linked itself from the real economy and declared finance itself a goal rather than serving the real economy. And that may all be true, but I can share with you a few facts that will surprise you, that just in the last 2 or 3 years, a silent revolution has generally started within the financial community. The conceptual seeds for this evolution within was laid more than a decade ago. 2004, for example, an important report was put out by Freshfield showing the materiality of non-financial issues. The Global Compact, together with IFC and Goldman Sachs Sustain, the London-based research arm, concluded in an important study called Who Cares Wins that only companies which also excel on environmental, social and governance issues can attain a true leadership role over time. The term ESG was coined. Then Nicholas Stern, obviously, in his path-breaking work on climate change, questioned the discounting methodologies and complained rightly that traditional net present value systems are inadequate to measure environmental impact. And the list goes on. So much conceptual work was done already more than 10 years ago. And yet, the world of finance has been lagging behind the corporate world on sustainability by 5 to 10 years. However, more recently, that gap is closing fast and rapidly, and I'll give you a few facts that may surprise you. First, when PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, were launched exactly 10 years ago, only 100 institutional investors had the courage to step forward arguing, well, environmental, social and governance issues actually may well matter, so we should better get a handle on them and start to integrate these issues somehow into our analysis and decision making. But the movement didn't really take off yet. Today, PRI just marked its 10th anniversary. There are 1,300 asset owners and asset managers who are well on their way developing ESG methodologies, benchmarks, and integrating them ever deeper into their portfolios. That move from 100 to 1,300, now representing $60 trillion worldwide, is phenomenal in its own right. Secondly, CDP, the formerly Carbon Disclosure Project, they started off 10 years ago, I believe, with something like 80 companies or 60 companies. Today, about 800, representing several trillion, tens of trillions of dollars in market capitalization, are engaged. It's an enormous growth. Most of the growth was seen in the last 2-3 years. In 2008, when we launched the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, only a few exchanges actually had the courage to step forward. And the World Federation of Exchanges showed up in our offices telling us, what are you doing, socialists? Don't meddle with markets. Markets function differently, not according to your sustainability paradigm. And they tried almost to intimidate us. Today, if you look, the World Federation of Exchanges has 2 top priorities. One of them is sustainability integration. There are today 50 exchanges worldwide which encourage all listed companies to disclose environmental, social, governance information. And a growing number of exchanges is actually making disclosure mandatory. What a sea change within what a short period of time. And that trend is here to stay. It is bound to reinforce because ESG integration is now seen as a competitive advantage. That is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And behind all this has been the big push around Paris and the build-up to Paris. A number of new investor coalitions emerged, which for the first time put a price tag on externalities, recognizing the real